Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a global geopolitics sort of Iran-Israel news update and a bit of analysis on what has happened, reporting the actual events of what has happened, and then some analysis of, why that's happened and where we go from here, with a really great excerpt at the end of the video that I think is really worth watching. So first of all, Israel decided that a tipping point had been reached with regard to enrichment of uranium by the Iranians. Their nuclear program is getting further and further along the way. And in fact, there seems to be some confirmation from international leaders that this is indeed the case. Emmanuel Macron's even come out and said, yeah, I've seen evidence to suggest they're pretty far along. And so Israel went and did a bunch of stuff in terms of striking military and technological scientific targets to better able them to strike targets again going forward, as in they've taken out radar installations and military personnel and air defense systems to make it even easier for them to do further strikes. And in fact, they're doing strikes right now, really. I think there are more explosions in Iran at the moment. But also they've taken out some important scientific nuclear facilities, although there are also claims that the ones that are deep underground, they just can't hit. Indeed, only supposedly the US has the ability to, the capability of the munitions to be able to strike targets at that kind of depth, maybe even not then, because there are supposed to be nuclear facilities deep underground. But certainly the above ground targets have been well damaged or destroyed by the Israelis. And we'll get a much better sense of the battle damage assessment as the days go on. The satellite images already coming out. But this was an updated list, and this is even somewhat out of date. This was yesterday afternoon, and actually there might be some additions to this. So, updated list of Iranian political, military, and institutional high-value targets confirmed, eliminated, and reportedly targeted as of 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time yesterday. Confirmed kill, Major General Hossein Salami, Commander-in-Chief of the IRGC, so Islamic Revolutionary Guard, Chief of General Staff of the Armed Forces, the Expediency Discernment Council member and advisor to the Supreme Leader, so that's Rear Admiral, Major General, Commander of the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, Brigadier General, head of IRGC's Missile and Aerospace Force, and by the way, he's a guy involved in Shahid's going to Russia, as we'll see in a second. We have the Deputy Head of the Atomic Energy Organization and Professor of Nuclear Engineering at Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran. We also have President of Islamic Azad University, so he's going to be a nuclear scientist there. We have the Head of Nuclear Engineering and a Nuclear Engineering Professor and a nuclear scientist. And then there are others as well, unconfirmed here, who might well have been targeted too and listed there. So a number of these who were taken out. I mean, just incredible from an organizational point of view, a military point of view. Almost half of Iran's senior decision makers and advisors to the Supreme Leader are dead, says Intel Schizo here, referencing this infographic. And actually there's another one that indicates it's possibly even worse. So here is an infographic that says that Russian air defenses, this is a parody account, Russian air defenses, because of course Iran use Russian air defenses, saved lives of 36% of the Iranian top commanders. In other words, 64% of them had died. The Western NATO NAFO rumor that Russian military hardware is useless is not true. Okay, so point here, though, is that a lot of senior commanders are dead. Arguably, the entire top four here, according to this infographic, and then some others further below as well. So my view is that aside from the politics of this and whether they should have had to have done this, because actually, really, there should have been an Iranian nuclear agreement still in place, but that was scrapped. Actually, we wouldn't be here if that was in place. And there's arguments about that. It depends which side of the political aisle you sit on to some degree. But I personally think that Trump scrapped the Obama era agreement because Obama did it, not because it was a good idea to scrap it. And actually, that has helped to get us to where we are now, where Israel are having to do military stuff against Iran, and this is destabilizing the entire region. Okay. So anyway, 2 more Iranian generals eliminated. So here a couple are mentioned, responsible for operations in the general staff and the head of intelligence there. A successful project here from the Israelis is that they also eliminated, as mentioned, Brigadier General Emir Ali Hajizadeh, the head of the airspace forces and Iranian armed forces. Directly involved he was in supplying Shahid drones to Russia, which killed hundreds of Ukrainians over the last 3 years. So the Ukrainians are going to be fairly happy with that. Okay, so the whole mission from the Israelis seemed to have exceeded expectations as far as I can work out. So it's very well carried out mission militarily, but also in terms of operations on the ground. So Mossad were doing things to destroy equipment, I believe, on the ground using some pretty decent technology, arguably, and a great deal of organization, possibly a year or so in the making. And there is a Spiderweb analog that took place. Anyway, Mick Ryan here says Mossad agents set up a drone base on Iranian soil near Tehran. The drones were activated overnight, striking surface-to-surface missile launchers aimed at Israel. That's a quote from the Times of Israel. How can we also do this while defending ourselves against such attacks, says Mick Ryan. So that's a question for any nation that's looking at this, which is, we've seen Spiderweb, we've seen it as in the Ukrainian mission against, or operation against, Russian strategic bombers that was so successful. Now we're hearing that Mossad have done this in Iran. How do we do that ourselves? Do we have the know-how? And also, how do we defend against that happening to us? Really important questions. So Israel employs the drone tactics used in Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb to turn Iran's nuclear dreams to ashes. Now, I don't know that they would have been looking at Ukraine and saying, "Oh, we need to do that." This would have been long in the making. I'm fairly sure that these would have been concurrently running operations, but it's interesting that they're definitely analogous. So we obviously know about the Ukrainian operation. We've heard an awful lot about that, but we've had the Israelis bombing all sorts of different targets, and pretty successfully, and launch sites and nuclear targets, but also arguably copying tactics or using the same tactics with those drones. And in fact, there's some footage to suggest that this is definitely the case. Chris O'Wiki says Israel launched drones which attacked targets in Iran using what may have been an identical method to that employed by Ukraine recently. A video shows what appears to be a commercial vehicle reportedly used as a drone launcher self-destructing near Tehran yesterday, or now 2 days ago. Compare this to the drone launchers used in Ukraine's recent Operation Spiderweb attack on a Russian Air Force. Wooden cabins carried on the back of flatbed trucks, which otherwise self-destructed after use, and we saw an explosion there. We don't know if that's definitely self-destruction. Israel does not appear to have publicized how it carried out the drone attacks, but the possible use of commercial vehicles as a drone launcher suggests a similar approach to that employed by Ukraine. The Israeli drones reportedly attacked Iranian air defenses, although we've also heard surface-to-surface missile systems pointed at Israel. In the Ukrainian case, the drones were smuggled into the country and set up in an anonymous warehouse in Chelyabinsk. Vehicle drivers were unsuspecting Russians who took delivery orders from an apparent Ukrainian operative. It's not clear who delivered the Israeli drones, but it's possible that they were also transported in the guise of commercial goods. Ukraine has twice now showed how commercial logistics networks can be weaponized, and that's reference to the Kerch Bridge explosion as well. It's unlikely that Ukraine and Israel collaborated to devise similar methods of attacking targets with drones. Instead, Ukraine's October 2022 Kerch Bridge attack using a massive bomb disguised as commercial cargo may have paved the way. As I documented in the thread linked below, Ukraine exploited the international road freight system to deliver its bomb to the Kerch Bridge. Somebody the other day was saying, I can't believe you're still claiming this was a truck or a lorry going across the bridge. It wasn't. It was boats, ships, whatever, drones. No, it wasn't. It was a truck, and it's very well documented now. It's quite likely the same method that will be used in future by other countries. Okay, so people possibly learning off Ukraine, but certainly some pretty incredible operations taking place, carried out by the Israelis here. Michael Weiss says impressive, and if more than 24 Iranian commanders were targeted, it means more kills will likely be confirmed. This goes back to the personnel death toll. So, quoting from, I don't know which newspaper this is, but zoom in. As it became clear Israel was about to attack, the commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Air Force convened in a bunker to coordinate the response. But Israel knew that emergency protocol and the location of the bunker. They destroyed it, killing the overall commander and the heads of the drone and air forces, defense forces. Quote, the fact that there was nobody to give the order neutralized an immediate Iranian response, an Israeli official said. So in other words, the idea that Iran in the end only managed 100 drones immediately in response, there were several waves of ballistic missiles later, possibly goes to show that Israel had mitigated an Iranian response really, really well. They're among the more than 24 Iranian commanders targeting in a sprawling attack on Iran's military command and control. The heads of the IRGC, the Iranian military, and Iran's emergency military headquarters were all eliminated in the opening salvo. Another key target was Iran's air defense systems and radars. Israeli intelligence mapped their locations, and most were hit by Israeli Air Force in the opening strike. That gave the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, virtually unchallenged freedom of operation in Iran's skies. So there was this kind of suppression of enemy air defense or destruction of enemy air defense that was so important for Israel to be able to fly with impunity, perhaps in Iranian skies. And then, meanwhile, on the ground, Israel's Mossad spy agency was conducting a series of covert sabotage operations deep inside Iran to take out air defenses and ballistic missile launchers. Hundreds of Mossad agents, both inside Iran and back in headquarters, were involved, including a special unit of Iranian operatives working for Mossad. In central Iran, Mossad commando units had positioned guided weapons systems in open areas near Iranian surface-to-air missile launchers. In another area inside Iran, Mossad covertly deployed weapon systems with sophisticated technologies hidden in vehicles. When the Israeli attack began, these weapons were launched and destroyed Iranian air defense targets. Incredible stuff. And here we have, by the way, Mossad have been doing stuff like this for some time. So back in 2020, during Trump 1.0, I know this is a September 2021 article from Times of Israel, but it's referring to a New York Times article that details an incredible operation that killed a nuclear scientist and professor. Top nuke scientist was killed with a remote operated machine gun. So this was a sort of Belgian machine gun put on an automated system. It weighed a ton, but it was smuggled into Iran in parts ahead of the operation and then reassembled. Mossad team handled the whole operation from a command center outside the country, according to the report, which the publication said was based on interviews with American, Israeli, and Iranian officials, including 2 intelligence officials familiar with the details of the planning and execution of the operation. The report detailed how Israel had been closely following this chap's career and movement since 2007. So it came to 2020, and then there was the assassination of this top Iranian nuclear scientist in a sophisticated hit where they deployed a computerized machine gun requiring no on-site operatives, taking less than a minute, and did not injure anyone else, including the scientist's wife, who was with him at the time. So incredible stuff, kind of like James Bond style operations taking place here. Quite incredible. And that's going back 5 years, right? So, Israel have been doing things, no doubt, in preparation of today for a long time, trying to take out Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons. So we saw yesterday that lots of places were attacked, lots of explosions, and then this was continuing throughout yesterday. Several places have been attacked by the Israeli Air Force, says Nobel reports. This is on top of what was initially attacked. Among targeted places were the Hamadan Air Base in Karaj, and areas both west and south of Tehran near Khabarovsk Shah. Israel seems to have total air superiority over Iran at this moment, and you could see drones flying over Iran, as I say, with impunity. A deputy governor of Hamadan province reports that the radar center in Nahavand was targeted in recent hours by Israeli strikes. So again, more smoking, smoldering sites with targets being destroyed, it seems, by the Israeli Air Force. Shashank Joshi reports from the Times of Israel. Israeli Air Force chief suggests Israel is going after Iranian missile launchers to limit Iranian retaliation. Quote, our presence in Western Iran is critical. Every launcher we strike saves lives in Israel, Barr says in a video published by the IDF. So again, systematically destroying Iranian air defenses, radar systems, and launchers. The land-based plant where Iran produced enriched uranium and had enriched it to 60% has been destroyed, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency chief Grossi. Although that's the land-based plant, that's a one above ground. The one below ground still survives. Now, Iran claimed that they shot down an Israeli F-35, showed an image. They also showed the pilot of the F-14 or something that shot it down. Supposedly, can't confirm that. Now, then the question is, and the question has been, how much did the US know about this? How much did they help with the Israeli attacks? And the claim from the Americans is that they didn't help with any material assistance in terms of planes and bombs and whatnot. Although there are claims that the British and Americans, I don't know, maybe others, helped with the taking down of some of the ballistic missiles and whatnot that were coming, or with the drones that were sent by Iran. But certainly in the case of the offensive operations by Israel, they seem to have done that all on their own. The question is, how much do the Americans know up front? And this is where it gets a bit funky. We're going to come to this a little bit later, but ABC has quoted a source familiar with the intelligence as saying the US has provided, quote, exquisite intelligence that and would help defend Israel as needed. So again, the defensive assistance there, but exquisite intelligence. Now, some people are questioning this. The source is an idiot. No one can say with slightest certainty what the US will do, as that depends entirely on Donald Trump's mind. But actually, I would suggest that intelligence might satellite imagery and whatnot. Israel do have their own satellite capabilities, of course, but you can imagine the US were involved. But actually, there is also this idea that Trump wasn't aware that this was going to happen when it happened. The timing of this is quite embarrassing for the US. And as I reported yesterday, and I was unsure because I did a bit of speculation on my behalf, on my part yesterday, where I said I don't think the US was up for this. They didn't really know this was going to happen, but since it's been so successful militarily, they're now saying, "Woohoo! Look at what we did. We are kind of like not responsible for it, but we gave Iran this ultimatum. They didn't follow through on the ultimatum, so Israel has done this, and kind of we really support it, and we're also going to take some kind of plaudits for that." So. And I was saying yesterday that Trump has this amazing ability to, no matter what the data is, say that he's somehow responsible for it if it is good, or blame someone if it's bad. And it can switch around, and he'll switch around his narrative. And he can sell that so easily to his audience. And I think that's what happened yesterday. But I think at the heart of it, Israel went and did things kind of unilaterally. And now probably the US is going to jump on the bandwagon, going on the coattails of Israel and kind of be very supportive of what Israel has done, quite probably because it's been a very successful. I mean, this is good news for the West in terms of if Iran doesn't escalate this to nuclear war, right, which is that I don't think they can do. Israel have put back the Iranian nuclear program by at least a couple of years, I would have thought. And that's a good thing, right? Now, French President Emmanuel Macron says that the information France had on the Iranian nuclear program was most concerning, adding that the program was close to a critical stage. So that then, from France, that then kind of confirms Israel's positioning that, they needed to go and do this because otherwise it was just a hop, skip and a jump for Iran to get to nuclear capability. Now, then Iran responded with, this is an extraordinary photo, with an attack on Tel Aviv particularly, where they were aiming for the basically the IDF headquarters, the Ministry of Defense headquarters there. And they did hit nearby it, but it was incredible. Like, the ballistic missiles were being shot down by the Iron Dome, but ballistic missiles did get through. And I think there was maybe, I saw a whole load of ballistic missiles hit what might be in a military base outside of Tel Aviv or somewhere. So who knows what damage was done to the Israelis, but they would probably still be happy with what they did to Iran. So footage of Iranian submarines launching ballistic missiles at Israel there that came out. Shashant Joshi says, an important signal. A senior Israeli security official tells Channel 12 that Israel has warned Iran that if it targets Israeli population centers with ballistic missiles, Israel would target regime leaders and state infrastructure such as oil refineries. So real overt, explicit threat to Iran that if you go and blow up city centers like or population centers, we will hit you hard. So then there was so much footage last night of strikes on Tel Aviv. The ballistic missiles were coming down thick and fast. You can see here imagery of air defense systems going up from well within the city confines there and firing at incoming ballistic missiles and whatnot. Have I got any of them hitting? Yeah, so you got ballistic missiles hitting there inside the city at the same point that these air defenses are firing off. So that's very close to the air defense system. That air defense system could be close to, I don't know, the Ministry of Defense headquarters or whatever. But there were lots of images and videos of these ballistic missiles slamming into parts of Israel. Here, Tel Aviv, that one again, but also, and there you got another one in the distance. You got several ballistics getting through. So the Iranians are able to get ballistic missiles through these air defenses. That's not wholly unsurprising. Ballistic missiles are really difficult to take down, and when you're sending so many there, you've got another one slamming right into the speed of that coming down is insane. Yeah, so the Iranians are able to cause damage, to hit targets. Well, the question is, do they hit on point? How accurate are these? So the HQ, the MOD HQ, as I keep calling it, I think it was the MOD HQ, was sort of slightly damaged as it was hit across the road, so it wasn't directly hit. And then, as I mentioned, there was a base that I saw a whole load of ballistic missiles, I think it was a base, slam into. Yeah, I can't find the one with multiple ballistics striking, but I mean, look at that picture. That's an amazing image of a ballistic missile hitting in Tel Aviv. And then we had THAAD systems. So THAAD systems are, some people have asked why Ukraine hasn't been given these, because actually they're not quite the system that Ukraine needs. So these are defensive systems that take out ballistic missiles in the upper atmosphere before they reach the nearer the targets. And so what do we have? Interceptor missiles firing all over the place. It's just got some absolutely incredible images of air defense operations. So this is a THAAD system taking out a ballistic missile in the upper atmosphere. Absolutely incredible. It looks almost beautiful. It looks like some kind of nebula there as it takes it out way up there in the atmosphere. Wonder what ends up raining down there on the land below. There's an amazing image of that THAAD interception. There it is again. Here again, you get so many missiles being blown up in the sky, hit by air defenses of different types. That looks like outside the Earth's atmosphere, so that will be the THAAD as well. And then just looked like absolute chaos. But obviously the Israelis did a really good job. Here are some of the images. Israelis did an incredible job of, I think, defending their land from these attacks, but obviously ones do get through, and that is what they have to worry about there. That's the image I was thinking of. Just an incredible image there of a THAAD intercepting a ballistic missile in essentially in the atmosphere. So, yeah, lots of images, and we don't know what the BDA, the battle damage assessment, would be for Israel, but I think they'd be a lot happier with where things are, because they have not only destroyed a lot of targets inside Iran, but they continue to do so. So this is this morning. An Israeli Air Force struck Mehrabad Airport, Hamadan, and a munitions depot in Zanjan. So that was, as morning was shortly arriving. Early this morning, Israel struck Iran's Parchin military industrial complex located 30 kilometers from Tehran. The site houses munitions and explosives testing facilities, with at least one building possibly linked to Iran's nuclear program, and there are some big explosions there you can see. So consistent attacks are still taking place in Iran. A vast number of explosions there, at least 4 or 5 explosions we can see taking place as this car drives past. Just incredible footage. And here, more explosions in Iran during the daytime. So I think Israel are just going to keep turning the screw on Iran. Israel suppressed Iranian ballistic missile launches by an order of magnitude. Huge success, says Shashank Joshi. So Iran's original plan was to fire 1,000 missiles at Israel, but Israel had done such a good job in the initial strikes that they were unable to do so. So here's a quote from the New York Times. Ultimately, Mr. Khamenei, so the Ayatollah of Iran, ordered Iran's military to fire on Israel. Initially, the plan was to launch up to 1,000 ballistic missiles on Israel to overwhelm its air defense and ensure maximum damage, according to 2 members of the Guards. But Israel's strikes on missile bases have made it impossible to move missiles quickly from storage and place them on launch pads, they added. So, Israel had successfully mitigated against that. Now, it's worth seeing the wider context as well. So why did this happen now? And we'll talk about this in a second, to do with the diplomacy taking place between the US and Iran. And this is why I think the US could have been really angry and embarrassed by this, but because of its success, Trump's turned that into yeah, that's cool. Because actually one of the main negotiators with the US was killed. One of the lead nuclear negotiators between Iran and the US that Trump had put so much store in. We're going to have this great diplomatic success. I ripped up the Iran agreement before. We're going to have this new agreement. And hey, I'm going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Honestly, this is part of this Nobel Peace Prize positioning. Then Israel has gone and done this, and he could have gone, blah, but he's pretty wily. And he's like, let's. It's always about, how does this make me look good? So he needs to sell this and making him look good. And I think he's kind of done that. Shashank Joshi says, Iran's strategy has been to keep the conflict at bay by using proxies and militias as a buffer. So Hezbollah and Hamas. But of course, Israel have done the whole... some of these have taken years to come to fruition. The Pages operation, where the Pages exploded and killed loads of Hezbollah people or maimed them or whatever, and what they did into Lebanon has been incredibly successful in decapitating Hezbollah. And then obviously Hamas are in a spot of bother, one might say. This has stopped Iran being able to put pressure on Israel locally. So then Israel can concentrate on hammering Iran, and they don't have the proxies to be able to fight on their behalf. So Iran's strategy has been to keep the conflict at bay, traditionally, by using proxies and militias as a buffer. But when the proxy militia system collapsed over the last 18 months, thanks in large part to the post-October the 7th dynamic, so after Hamas did that attack in October the 7th, then it kicked Israel into doing a whole bunch of stuff. Now, I would complain that some of what Israel have done, or a lot of what they've done concerning Gaza, has been horrific and genocidal, and I'm completely against that. But some of the other kind of successful military operations have been very useful for Israel and far more, I think, defensible. It left Iran extraordinarily vulnerable. The result is now playing out over Iran. So decades of investing in proxies rather than doing something about irregular armed forces built around a pre-1979 equipment from the US and a variety pack of Soviet-era stuff has come back to bite the Iranians there. Now, what is fascinating, so as we move on to the final part of the video, which is, okay, geopolitically, what's going on? What does this mean? What happens going forward? Russia has come out supporting Iran, but of course they have to, because I forgot this. Of course, just a few months ago, they signed a bilateral security partnership with Iran, which was not quite the one they signed with North Korea, which would have It was kind of Article 5 one with North Korea. That's why you've got North Korean soldiers fighting in Russia because of that agreement. And North Korea don't mind doing that. Now, it's not quite the same as the one with Iran. So you're not going to see Russian troops rushing to fight in Iran, possibly because they can't afford to give them those troops. But also, they didn't write that into the security agreement. But there is a formal partnership. And Israel, with the backing of the United States, has now hammered Iran, which is Russia's ally. So this then presents a very interesting dynamic with regard to MAGA support for Israel in hitting Iran, because Russia are Iran's friends, but a lot of MAGA supporters support Russia or don't mind Russia doing their things against Ukraine and see Ukraine as this big deep state project that they're desperately against. Well, actually, what goes on here? So when you've had MAGA extolling the virtues of Moscow, when you've had Errol Musk and Alex Jones and all these people, Dmitry Simes, all these people going over to Moscow to wax lyrical about how wonderful Russia is, and then you've got Israel doing this against Iran, but Russia's supposed to be Iran's friends, then you've got some serious cognitive dissonance going on in many of these people. And in fact, we can see that here by Tucker Carlson. So Tucker Carlson has come out and said, the real divide isn't between people who support Israel and people who support Iran or the Palestinians. The real divide is between those who casually encourage violence. So he's having to spin this in a way that can allow him to maintain support for Russia. So, okay, I would otherwise be for what Israel is doing, but I need to be supportive of Russia. So how do I continue doing that? Well, this is just violence. I'm going to be against violence in general. Russia want the war in Ukraine to stop. Ukraine is just wanting to continue this war on and on and on. They are just warmongers. And the US supporting Ukraine is the US being warmongers. And the US supporting Israel is the US being warmongers. So I'm against warmongering. And this is how Tucker Carlson sells it. The real divide is between those who casually encourage violence and those who seek to prevent it, between more warmongers and peacemakers. Who are the warmongers? They would include anyone who's calling Donald Trump today to demand airstrikes and other direct US military involvement in a war with Iran. On that list, and this is where it gets, popcorn eating time. So Tucker Carlson has a go at his former Fox News friends, people like Sean Hannity, who are massive Trump supporters, but people who exist firmly in the middle of the MAGA information ecosystem. This is sort of a civil war here, you can see. So Tucker Carlson says, on that list of warmongers is Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, Rupert Murdoch, Ike Perlmutter, and Miriam Adelson. So Miriam Adelson is a Jewish donor to the Republican Party of gazillions of dollars. So Elon Musk, obviously we know how much he gave to the GOP and to Donald Trump. Well, Miriam Adelson is perhaps the second biggest donor, or up there in the top 5. I'm pretty sure she's the second biggest one. Absolutely huge tranches of money she's given to the Republican Party. And now Tucker Carlson is calling her out. That is quite an interesting dynamic. So at some point they will all have to answer for this, but you should know their names now. So he's starting up a position of attacking some of these core Republican MAGA personnel. People like Rupert Murdoch is an interesting one. So he has a New York Post, which is quite critical of Trump in Ukraine. He has the Wall Street Journal, which has been one of the newspapers that have been most critical from a Republican point of view of Trump's tenure. So Rupert Murdoch, that's interesting that he is included there. Now, Ed Kresenstein says the GOP is starting to fracture with Tucker Carlson attacking Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, Rupert Murdoch, and essentially Trump. Trump knew this attack was going down and he didn't stop it. For the record, I'm not saying this was a mistake by Israel. The real mistake happened in 2018 when Trump decided to pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal that limited uranium enrichment. And this is what many people, and I would be in agreement with this, because at the time I said, and I've interviewed some Iranians on this. Kaveh Mousavi, I have interviewed twice, once I think on this channel, once on my other channel. And when I was receiving my stem cell therapy in Moscow, I interviewed Kaveh Mousavi from there, from my clinic room, hospital room there. I interviewed Kaveh Mousavi just as this was all kind of going on. And, Trump putting out of that deal was bad news, definitely. is my opinion. I know many Republicans won't agree. Operation Rising Lion is now on its second day. Mick Ryan, the retired Australian general, gives his tuppence before we go on to the final part. What insights can be gleaned and what are the key questions about the ongoing war? So from a military point of view, he says, I think these are key questions and key issues and questions at the 24-hour mark of the war. I will cover a couple briefly. So one, Israel's decapitation operations, the US reaction, the battle of narratives. Has Iran learned from Russia? Have Israel and Ukraine been collaborating on creative drone operations? Lessons for crewed, uncrewed teaming, reinforcing the need for national air, drone and missile defense. How long can Israel sustain operations? Impact on Ukraine? Who else might exploit this opportunity? So Israel's decapitation operations. Israel targeted multiple military and scientific leaders in the first wave of attacks. Israel's decapitation operations, there are short-term and long-term reasons for this. First, the immediate desired impact was to degrade strategic decision-making. The longer-term reasons are about removing Iranian leaders responsible for development of nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles. Regime change is also one of the objectives of Israel's campaign against Iran. See Netanyahu's speech on that issue. The US reaction, the social media post by Trump after the beginning of Israel's attack states, I gave Iran a chance after chance to make a deal. I told them in the strongest of words to just do it, but no matter how hard they tried, they just couldn't get it done. Israel clearly has the support of America in the conduct of these attacks. Finally, how long can Israel sustain operations? This will depend on three determinants. First, what are Israel's strategic and operational objectives in its assault on Iran? The second determinant is the level of stockpiling of munitions, aircraft spare parts and air defense interceptors. And the third determinant is whether the US is willing to top up Israel's supplies of munitions. It has in the past. It is probable that Israel's attacks may last for weeks and not days. Okay, so that's a really quick synopsis. Let's go to a longer geopolitical analysis here between Alistair Campbell on the left and Rory Stewart on the right. And this, I think, is an absolutely brilliant analysis.
And to ask yourself what options Iran's got. And of course, it's true. Iran has to some extent been exposed as a paper tiger. And there'll be a whole debate taking place there. So there's that framing of it. You know, why did the timing come then? What was the nature of the surgical strike? What can the Iranian regime do back? But there's a much bigger question, which is this was in the middle of a peace negotiation. And the action that Israel has taken is, to put it mildly, very, very questionable under international law, whether they remotely cross the threshold for a preemptive strike. So there would have been, I guess, if we'd been talking about this even 3 years ago, much more talk about what on earth is going on. How is the world getting into people taking this kind of unilateral action? But it's very interesting how quickly we now almost take that for granted and are into the question of the tech. On the Iranian response, I think
just
that
on the
also,
Rory, just before we leave that point, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is unbelievably significant because we should remind listeners and viewers that Netanyahu is already indicted on allegations of war crimes in relation to Gaza. But the fact that I think we said this at the time, but the fact that he can go to Washington and sit down with Donald Trump and talk about all this without that even being mentioned or raised or even part of the debate underlines this notion that we kind of are living in an era of impunity. So Netanyahu, if he thinks he can do this, he will do it. And what's more, they're indicating that this is going to go on for some time. This is not a sort of one-day wonder.
Yes. And let maybe just develop that one more point. So I think the important context is to remind people that Trump thought that he was in the middle of a negotiation. He thought that he was going to, maybe overly optimistically, get a deal out of Iran. As we've talked about on the podcast before, he's chasing a Nobel Peace Prize. And
don't dismiss that. I mean, he literally is. He sees these Israel Gaza, Israel Iran or the Iran deal and Ukraine Russia as his ticket to a Nobel Peace Prize. And the question is, has this ruined his chance of getting that? Because he ain't going to do a deal with Iran now. Or does he say, as he said yesterday, what Israel has done has now pushed Iran closer to having to do a deal with us. So actually he's taken what Israel has done, and rather than ruining the diplomacy, he's saying, actually, this has helped the diplomacy. This has forced Iran into more of a corner where they're forced to come to a deal with me and I'll still get my Nobel Peace Prize.
And this was meant to be part of the deal of his Middle East trip. And a lot of his posts on Truth Social have been directed to Iran. And maybe we'll ask you to talk a little bit more about the old Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, but having taken people out of that, it looked as though Trump was on track to create a new one. And the idea was going to be that Iran would agree to not build up its nuclear program in return for sanctions being lifted and peace across the region. And Trump had support for this, for example, from other regions in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia is much less worried by Iran than it would have been a few years ago. China brokered a deal between Saudi and Iran. So there was a direction, possible direction, in which Iran was moving to a peace deal. At which point, Israel seems to have informed the United States that they were considering a strike. But the nature of this strike appears to have been very unclear to the US, and which is extraordinary. Because if you look at the messages that the US State Department was passing to its embassies, which is our best indication on how worried they were and what...
This is such an important point, right? So the US clearly wasn't aware that this was going to happen. They knew that something was going on. They're probably providing intelligence, like satellite, as they probably always do, to Israel. And that's kind of the idea of this exquisite intelligence that Israel is getting. That's probably nothing unusual. But they were aware, they weren't aware that Israel was going to do this. And as he says, you can tell by embassy declarations. And this is a case in Ukraine as well. When the US embassy makes an announcement of like, oh, can all US citizens be very mindful X, Y, and Z, it means that Russia's getting ready for an Airstrike missile strike. So the declarations from the US embassies are pretty indicative often, but there was no sense that this was going to happen. The US embassies weren't kind of declaring anything.
What they were expecting. There were some very, very mixed messages coming out yesterday afternoon. Is this about just non-essential staff? Is this about all staff? What kind of threat do we face? Which suggests, actually, even as late as yesterday afternoon, they didn't have a confident, detailed view on what Israel was going to do. Trump almost certainly did not want them to do it, and we can come back to that. But the logic...
This is a total key. So, like, this is exactly what I said yesterday. And so I feel somewhat vindicated because I was massively speculating. But the idea is that Trump didn't agree with it, didn't know it's going to happen, but then jumped on it and said, well, that's awesome, thank you very much, Israel, and is now championing what Israel has done because he's going to capitalize upon that.
Logic of this is, if he did allow them to do it, if Witkoff and Trump thought this was a good idea in the negotiation, they're unbelievably naive because, as you pointed out, this is the end of the negotiation. This is the end of any peace deal. The logical move now from Iran is to accelerate its nuclear weapons program and just back out of the whole thing. So my suspicion is Trump can't, and Witkoff and their system can't be that naive. They must have seen the risk of this doing, which raises the question of what on earth is the world that now exists, that Netanyahu, using American weapons, closely allied with the United States, launches an attack that the US president not only doesn't want, but hadn't been informed about in detail, and probably does so because Netanyahu senses that we're in a new world order in which he can get away with these things.
And that's why I think, look, I don't know, I'm not inside the guy's head, and but I sense from what he said, if you go through the tone of his posts and his comments in the run-up, it was indicating, I'm the great deal maker. I've got Steve Witkoff on the case. We're going to get somewhere on this, okay? The only way that it can be post facto justified by him now saying to Dana Bash and presumably to others, yeah, I'm totally with them, this was a great hit. The only way you can justify that if he thinks that he can get Iran into a better position, he's now talking about giving them a second chance, by now suggesting that actually he's been part of this all along. But that goes completely contradictory to the noises, as you say, that were coming out before. I do
There's
think...
a problem, Alistair. Can I just interrupt on that?
Yeah.
Because just to push you back on that, I mean, the part of the problem is that how can Iran now believe that he can control Israel? So let's say he went back to Iran and said...
This is a really fascinating part of the discussion, by the way. So the idea for Iran, they'll tell you this better, but Iran is now looking at the US and say, well, we can't go back to do diplomacy with you because you are just being taken advantage of by Israel, and you didn't even know they were going to do that. So you can't give us any guarantees again because Israel have acted unilaterally without your knowledge, and they've done that. And so if you're going to say, well, let's go and do some deal, then there's nothing to say that Israel won't do this again. So screw you, the US. We're not going to entertain you.
Okay, you get a second chance. If you sit down at the negotiating table, you won't be hit again. Will Iran not think, what do you mean you can guarantee we won't be hit again? What's to stop Netanyahu just continuing to do it? And of course, Netanyahu has said that this is just the beginning. This is going to go on for days and weeks. And probably Netanyahu needs this to go on for days and weeks because he doesn't want to be accused by his own right wing of having mounted one attack which didn't actually eliminate their entire nuclear operations. A lot of their nuclear operations are still intact. Netanyahu sees this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to flatten Iran's nuclear program. So he will continue. And he probably, if Trump tries to stop him, it'll be like Trump trying to stop Putin. Netanyahu will know perfectly well that he can ignore him, and Trump won't follow through with sanctioning Israel. So how can Iran trust the US now in this deal?
Well, they can't. And what's more, they're probably sitting there thinking, well, Israel has given us the opportunity to be able to push back on the Americans without really feeling that Trump wants to sort of go back hard on them. And I think you talk about his obsession with this idea of getting the Nobel Prize. Let's be frank. Of the three big foreign policy issues that he said he was going to sort out because he's the greatest deal maker on the planet, Putin is, to use his own phrase, been tapping him out. And that is going nowhere. The negotiations there appear to be going nowhere. Middle East, that's what we've seen in the last 24 hours, not really going anywhere. Whether we're talking about Ukraine, about Israel, Gaza, or now about Israel, Iran, he projects himself as the guy who's got all the power, to use his phrase, holding all the cards. But actually, he's the one who's looking a little bit like a paper tiger right now. And so, and I honestly do think, Roy, we've got to go back to this deal. It's almost 10 years ago now. And I think, you may know more about the deal than I do, but I feel that actually it was a pretty amazing piece of diplomatic work to get that deal done. To have Donald Trump in the middle of his 2016 election campaign just come out and say, it's a terrible deal, I'll get a better deal, I'm going to pull the plug on it, and then to do it, I think that is a big part of where we are now today on this issue.
Let's come back to Iran's response for a second. So,
sorry, Roy, do you disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree with you at all. I think that what you've put your finger on is a lot of things. One of them is that at best what he tries to do is wait for events to happen and then try to take credit for them.
Boom. Exactly what I said yesterday.
So he tries to cover up the fact that this is not what he wanted, didn't happen in the way that he wanted, by claiming it was his idea all along. But it also suggests that his power is waning, American power is waning, that you don't get to do what he's done, which is say, we're not going to be the global policeman anymore. We don't really care about the rules-based international order. We don't really care about international security. You don't get to do that without going into a situation in which you no longer have the power to determine events. I mean, why would Netanyahu pay any attention to the US? The story 6 months ago would have been, well, of course he's got to pay attention to the US because he gets all his weapons and support from the US. But as we've seen with Putin, and Putin is much less close to the United States than Israel is to the United States, when Trump threatened Putin with sanctions and said, if you don't, I'm horrified that you made this attack, I'm going to sanction you, don't, Putin simply ignores him and just continues. He knows perfectly well that Trump is never going to sanction him. And Netanyahu must know perfectly well that whatever he does, literally whatever he does, Trump will continue to supply him with weapons.
There's also something really interesting there about the history of nuclear proliferation.
And I'll leave it there. Fascinating discussion. But the end conclusion there is that this all indicates a waning of US power. geopolitically, globally, that Putin can just ignore the US and actually have Trump in his hands and manipulate Trump and have the whole Trump administration rhetorically, it appears, on their side, or completely unwilling to do anything that would put pressure on Russia. And you've got Netanyahu having Trump in his hands. As Rory Stewart says, there's literally nothing that Israel can do. They've already done genocide in Gaza, and the US hasn't really done anything about it. They have started a war with Iran, and the US didn't want that, but then has gone, okay, brilliant, thanks for that. In other words, Netanyahu can do whatever he likes, and Trump has to just follow along like a poodle. And this is showing that the US power is not what defines what goes on around the world necessarily anymore. That actually there are people working unilaterally, knowing that the US will not do anything about what they do. And I think that's an extraordinary conclusion to come to, but I think it's fairly justified conclusion there. And then just a little thing to add at the end, while the US has also been denuding themselves of soft power around the world, defunding USAID, Voice of America, and so on and so forth, we've got USAGM today urgently called back to work the staff of Voice of America's Farsi language service. So all have been on paid leave, admin leave, for the past 3 months, with the rest of VOA's silenced journalists. Oh, look, we need some influence now in that neck of the woods. Oh, but we'd sack them all because USAID funding, Doge, blah, blah, blah. Oh, look, there's a reason that you've been spending that money, return on investment. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. There you go. So let me know what you think. That's a synopsis of everything. Hopefully it all makes sense. I'm no expert on this region. Am I an expert on anything? No. So it is what it is. I'm sure I've made lots of mistakes. You can call me out on that. But I think that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of what has happened. What will happen is that, as Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell indicate, is that Iran are just going to double down now, because they have no motivation to go the diplomatic route, because they can't trust the US to do anything other than, well, whatever Netanyahu dictates. And so they are essentially now against Israel and the US. Will they target US facilities? Unlikely, but possible. What will Russia do? That's going to be interesting. There are other dynamics like Saudi Arabia, because you've got the Shia Sunni divide there, where Iran, Shia Muslims, Saudi Arabia, Sunni Muslims. So that there's no love lost between those nations. So are they going to come to a kind of Islamic regional aid of Iran? No. So actually, what are Iran's choices here? Do they double down, knowing that actually the US can continue supplying Israel with lots of weaponry, and Israel can now possibly just go even harder at Iran? And if they have that air superiority, are these ballistic missiles and launchers going to be able? So they keep a lot of them deep underground. We've seen lots of images. In fact, the Russian media have been showing more videos of lots of ballistic missiles underground that the Israelis won't be able to hit, but they've got to come out at some point to be fired. Are Israel going to be able to completely take out Iran's capabilities right across the board, that only the most underground of facilities are going to remain functional? But Iran aren't going to necessarily be incentivized to do diplomacy, but then does it get to a point where they literally have no other option? They've doubled down, and Israel just completely militarily takes them out of the game. Going to be interesting. Of course, what Trump will do at every point during whatever process it is, he will take responsibility and champion whatever is happening. It's that ex post facto, this after the fact. You get in, quite often talk in philosophy about post hoc rationalization and psychology. Post hoc rationalization, which is rationalizing after the fact. So you're like, oh, that's happened. Now I'll rationalize how that happened, and it was good that happened now that it has happened. And I'm kind of generating rationale for that after the fact. And that's what Trump is so good at doing. And he will continue, no doubt, to do so. So no matter what the outcomes, he's going to try and sell it as further justification that he should get the Nobel Peace Prize, I'm sure. Anyway, let me know what you think. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.